The fundamental architecture of the Cold War was not built of concrete and barbed wire alone, but of the control of information, a battle for the mind where the American model of a chaotic, free, and competitive marketplace of ideas collided head-on with the Soviet model of a totalized, state-mandated truth in the United States. The First Amendment created an environment of radical information transparency, where the press functioned as the fourth estate, a decentralized and often adversarial power that investigated government failures, exposed scandals like Watergate, and reflected the dizzying diversity of public opinion. This freedom was messy, loud, and often contradictory, but it ensured that the American citizen had access to multiple versions of reality, allowing them to form their own conclusions. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet state operated on the premise that information was a strategic resource of the party, a tool for ideological mobilization rather than a medium for truth. The entire information landscape was governed by Glavlit, the General Directorate for the Protection of State Secrets, a massive censorship apparatus that pre-approved every single word printed in a newspaper, broadcast on the radio, or spoken in a play. The goal was not to inform the public, but to construct a parallel reality where the Soviet system was flawless. The leadership was infallible, and the West was perpetually on the brink of collapse. This fundamental contrast, information as a right versus information as a weapon, created two entirely different human experiences. One where the citizen was overwhelmed by choice, and one where the citizen was starved by a state-imposed famine of facts. And if you watch this series to the end, you will see how the Soviet attempt to ban the truth became the very thing that ensured the system's eventual silent implosion. The role of the independent journalist versus the state propagandist defined the integrity of the information stream. In the US, journalism was a profession protected by law and driven by the market, where a scoop or an expose was the ultimate currency of success. Journalists like Woodward and Bernstein became cultural heroes because they challenged the highest levels of power, proving that in a free society, the truth could be a career-making weapon against corruption. This competitive environment, while prone to sensationalism, ensured a constant pressure for accountability. In the USSR, there was no such thing as an independent journalist. Every writer was a state employee, and every newspaper, from the massive Pravda, Truth, to the local factory bulletin, was an organ of the Communist Party. The journalist's role was to be a transmission belt for party directives, translating complex political goals into simplified, heroic narratives for the masses. Creativity was permitted only within the rigid confines of socialist realism, and any deviation from the official line was treated not as a professional error, but as a political crime. The result was a media landscape of crushing uniformity, where every newspaper carried the same lead story, the same statistics of overfulfilled quotas, and the same vilification of Western imperialism. The American citizen learned what was happening. The Soviet citizen learned what the party wanted them to think was happening, a gap in reality so vast that it eventually forced the Soviet population to develop a sophisticated, cynical ability to read between the lines, searching for the truth in the silences and the carefully coded language of their own state media. The control of technology and the means of reproduction was the hidden front of the information war. In the US, the 1970s saw an explosion of information technology. The rapid spread of the Xerox photocopier, the ubiquity of the portable cassette recorder, and the democratization of the printing press. These tools allowed any individual or small group to become a publisher, fueling a vibrant counterculture of zines, underground newspapers, and radical pamphlets. The state had no power to stop the physical spread of ideas because the technology was in private hands. In the USSR, the state held a total monopoly on the means of reproduction. A simple photocopier was a state secret, kept in a locked room with a dedicated guard, and every typewriter had to be registered with the authorities. The sample of its font kept on file by the KGB to track any unauthorized document back to its source. The state understood that the ability to copy information was the ability to bypass the censor. So it treated paper and ink as if they were ammunition. This extreme technological Paranoia created a society where a single unauthorized typed page could be a ticket to the gulag, forcing the people into the heroic, agonizing process of Samizdat, self-publishing, where forbidden books and political tracts were painstakingly copied by hand or with carbon paper, passed from person to person in a secret, human chain of information. The American took the ease of copying for granted. The Soviet citizen risked their life to duplicate a single poem by Mandelstam or a chapter of Solzhenitsyn, proving that the state's greatest fear was not a bomb, but a duplicating machine. The contrast in foreign news and global perspective created two different levels of world consciousness. The American citizen was constantly exposed to global events through a variety of lenses: commercial news networks, international newspapers, and academic journals, providing a complex, if sometimes biased, view of the world beyond their borders. The free flow of information ensured that the U.S. was culturally and intellectually integrated into the global community. The Soviet state practiced systemic information isolation, treating foreign news as a dangerous contagion. Foreign newspapers were available only in highly restricted special storage, spetsgren, sections of libraries, accessible only to those with high-level security clearances, and the official news agency, TASS, heavily filtered every international story to fit the narrative of capitalist decay and socialist triumph. This created a population that was profoundly curious about the outside world, but possessed only a distorted, cartoonish understanding of it. This vacuum was filled by the shortwave radio, as millions of Soviet citizens tuned into the Voice of America, the BBC or Radio Liberty. These broadcasts were the only window into reality, providing the counter-truth that the state worked so hard to jam. The state spent more money on electronic jamming stations than it did on its own domestic broadcasting. A desperate, expensive attempt to drown out the truth with static, but the static only served to prove to the listener that what was being jammed was precisely what they needed to hear, making the act of listening a nightly ritual of intellectual survival. The ultimate psychological outcome of total censorship was the death of trust and the birth of a double life. In the U.S., the abundance of information led to a healthy skepticism and a constant public debate over what was true, creating a society that was resilient because it was used to questioning authority. In the USSR, the total monopoly on truth led to a total collapse of belief in official words. The Soviet citizen learned early in life to maintain two entirely different vocabularies. The public vocabulary of the Soviet man, wooden, cliched, and loyal, and a private vocabulary of the kitchen table, honest, cynical, and deeply informed by forbidden sources. This split personality was a survival mechanism in a world where the state demanded not just obedience, but the public performance of belief. The state succeeded in silencing the public square, but it failed to capture the private mind, creating a society of inner immigrants who lived in a state of quiet, internal exile from their own government. The American citizen struggled to find the truth in the noise. The Soviet citizen struggled to preserve the truth in the silence. A contrast that defined the moral landscape of the Cold War and ensured that when the system finally began to crack under the pressure of glasnost, the flood of suppressed information would act like an acid, dissolving the ideological foundations of the Soviet state in a matter of months. The machinery of Glavlit and the ritual of censorship was a bureaucratic monster that had no equivalent in the Western world. In the United States, the concept of prior restraint, the government stopping a story before it is published, was virtually non-existent and unconstitutional, protected by landmark Supreme Court cases that allowed newspapers like the New York Times to publish the Pentagon Papers even when they exposed government lies. The American press operated on the principle of post-publication accountability, where the only limit was the law of libel. In the USSR, every single printing press had a dedicated Glavlit censor assigned to it, a ghost-like figure whose job was to ensure that not a single word, photograph, or even a caption deviated from the party's approved reality. The censor's handbook was a massive, ever-changing list of forbidden topics, from military disasters and natural catastrophes to the actual prices of meat or the health of the general secretary. This invisible filter ensured that the Soviet public lived in a state of enforced optimism, where every problem was temporary and every success was heroic, creating a psychological dissonance that forced people to trust their eyes less than the printed page. The American citizen lived in a world of information risks and scandals. The Soviet citizen lived in a world of information silence, a silence so profound that it made the eventual discovery of the truth a revolutionary act. The terrifying contrast in handling state secrets and public scandals revealed the true nature of power in both systems. In the U.S., the Watergate scandal proved that the press could bring down a president, demonstrating that the law and the truth were higher than the office of the executive. The constant leak of classified information by whistleblowers and journalists was a messy but essential part of a functioning democracy, ensuring that power remained fearful of exposure. In the USSR, everything was a state secret. The map of a city was distorted to confuse spies. The statistics on infant mortality were classified to hide systemic failure, and the very existence of a nuclear accident like KYSHDYM or later Chernobyl was initially denied and hidden from the population. The Soviet state believed that what the people don't know won't hurt the party, a philosophy that led to the death of thousands who were never warned of radiation or toxic leaks. The American citizen was protected by the right to know. The Soviet citizen was endangered by the duty to ignore. This systemic secrecy was not just about security, it was about protecting the infallibility of the ideology, ensuring that the populace never saw the cracks in the foundation until the entire building was ready to collapse. The role of the foreign correspondent and the information bubble created two vastly different levels of global awareness. The American journalist abroad was an explorer, seeking to bring the reality of different cultures and conflicts back to the U.S. audience, often criticizing American foreign policy in the process, which created a well-informed, if often polarized, public in the USSR. Foreign correspondents were effectively intelligence operatives in suits. Their primary task was to gather information for the state and to produce distorted mirrors of life in the West for the domestic audience. They focused exclusively on American poverty, racial riots, and unemployment, creating a caricature of the West that was designed to make the Soviet citizen grateful for their own meager existence. This manufactured ignorance was a crucial pillar of control, as it prevented the population from realizing that the capitalist hell they were told about actually possessed a standard of living that this socialist paradise could not match in 100 years. The American citizen was a global participant. The Soviet citizen was a prisoner of a manufactured narrative, their only escape being the dangerous, illegal act of searching for truth in foreign radio broadcasts. The emergence of Samizdat and the underground war for the mind was the most heroic chapter of the Soviet information struggle. In the US, underground media was a choice, a way for radicals and counterculture figures to express niche ideas, and while they faced social pressure, they almost never faced the gulag. In the USSR, Samizdat, the secret typing and retyping of forbidden manuscripts, was a desperate necessity for intellectual survival. It was a world where 5 carbon copies of a poem were a political act, where people risked 7 years in a labor camp just to share a book by Solzhenitsyn or a political essay by Sakharov. This clandestine network was the true internet of the Soviet era, a slow, human-powered web of trust that bypassed the censors and kept the spirit of critical thought alive. The state fought Samizdat with the full force of the KGB, raiding apartments and tracking typewriter fonts. But they could not stop the hunger for the word. The American citizen consumed information as a commodity. The Soviet dissident consumed the word as a sacrament, a life-saving truth that was worth the risk of total erasure by the state. The final psychological weapon of the Soviet state was the monopoly on history and memory. In the US, history was a battlefield of competing interpretations, where historians constantly re-examined the past, exposed national sins, and challenged official myths, ensuring that the national memory remained a living, evolving thing. In the USSR, history was a branch of propaganda, where the past was unpredictable because it was constantly being rewritten to serve the present needs of the party. Leaders who fell from grace were literally airbrushed out of official photographs, and historical events were erased from textbooks as if they never happened. This memory holing was designed to make the party the sole source of truth, depriving the individual of a stable past and making them entirely dependent on the state's current version of reality. The American citizen possessed their own history. The Soviet citizen was gaslit by the state. Their own memories were contradicted by the newspaper, leading to a profound sense of alienation and the realization that in the USSR, even the past was not safe from the censor's red pen. The technological war over shortwave radio and the voices from the West represented the only real crack in the Iron Curtain's information monopoly. In the United States, the radio was a medium of entertainment, commercial advertising, and localized news, governed by the FCC but largely free to broadcast any political opinion, a symbol of a society where airwaves were open and pluralistic for the Soviet citizen. The radio was a tool of survival, the only source of the counter-truth that bypassed the Glavlit censors. Stations like Voice of America, VOA, Radio Liberty, and the BBC World Service became the lifeline of the Soviet intelligentsia and the curious worker alike, providing news about Soviet crop failures, human rights abuses, and the real lives of people in the West. The Soviet response was a massive, expensive infrastructure of electronic jamming stations. Thousands of towers emitting a deafening wall of white noise and sirens designed to make the Western broadcasts unlistenable. The state spent more on jamming the truth than it did on its own domestic cultural programming, creating a nightly ritual for millions of citizens, hunched over VF or Spidola radio, slowly turning the dial, searching for the tiny frequency where the Western voice could be heard through the static. The American took the clarity of his signal for granted. The Soviet listener developed an ear for the truth, learning to decipher meaning through the fog of state-mandated noise, a struggle that proved the Soviet government was more afraid of a single radio broadcast than an entire army. The contrast in educational systems and the curation of knowledge shaped the minds of the two populations in fundamentally different ways. The American university system, while subject to its own cultural biases, was built on the principle of academic freedom and the Great Conversation, where students were encouraged to read primary sources, debate conflicting ideologies, and question established historical narratives, creating a population that, even if not always well-informed, possessed the tools for independent critical thought. The Soviet educational system was a machine for ideological reproduction, where every textbook, from mathematics to history, was a tool of Marxist-Leninist indoctrination. The special storage, Spetsgrin, sections of Soviet libraries contained millions of dangerous books, from Western philosophy and sociology to the works of disgraced Bolshevik leaders, accessible only to those with high-level political clearance. This curation of knowledge ensured that the average student was intellectually isolated, fed a sanitized, state-approved version of reality that erased national sins and exaggerated socialist triumphs. The American student was taught how to think. The Soviet student was taught what to believe, a difference that created a profound intellectual hunger in the USSR, leading to the clandestine circulation of forbidden knowledge that eventually became the intellectual fuel for the system's collapse. The role of scandals, whistleblowers, and leaks demonstrated the strength of a transparent society versus the fragility of a closed one. In the US, the 1970s was the decade of exposure. The Pentagon Papers revealed the hidden history of the Vietnam War, and Watergate showed that even the president could not hide from a determined press. These leaks were painful and destabilizing, but they acted as a purification mechanism, forcing the government to be more accountable and the public to be more vigilant. In the USSR, there were no leaks in the Western sense, because the state controlled every channel through which a leak could travel. Any official who attempted to expose corruption or incompetence was not a whistleblower, but a traitor to the motherland, facing immediate arrest and erasure. This total suppression of bad news created a feedback vacuum, where the central leadership often remained ignorant of the true depth of systemic failures, from industrial accidents to local famines, because everyone in the chain of command was terrified to report anything but success. The American system grew stronger by exposing its wounds. The Soviet system rotted from within by pretending it was perfectly healthy, a silence that led directly to the catastrophic unpreparedness of the leadership when real crises like Chernobyl finally exploded. The existence and function of the rumor mill, Sarafanoy radio, was the Soviet society's natural defense against the state's monopoly on lies. In the US, rumors existed, but were constantly checked and balanced by the sheer volume of official, verified, and competing information sources, making it difficult for a single conspiracy theory to dominate the public mind. In the USSR, the total lack of trust in official media, Pravda and Izvestia, turned the entire nation into a massive, informal network of whispers. People relied on the word of a friend to learn about plane crashes, price hikes, or the death of a leader, because they knew the state would either lie or remain silent. This Sarafanoy radio, gossip radio, was often inaccurate and fueled by paranoia, but it was the only free press the people had, creating a society where the citizen was simultaneously hyper-skeptical of the newspaper and hyper-credulous of the rumor. This breakdown of official communication meant that the Soviet state lost the ability to mobilize or even inform its own people in times of crisis, as the population had long ago learned that the louder the state proclaimed its success, the more certain it was that a disaster was being hidden, a psychological divorce between the ruler and the ruled that no amount of propaganda could ever bridge. The ultimate contrast was found in the freedom to be wrong versus the duty to be correct. The American system accepted the information explosion with all its flaws, misinformation, sensationalism, and noise, because it valued the individual's right to navigate the truth for themselves, believing that in the marketplace of ideas, the truth would eventually prevail. The Soviet system was terrified of the individual's judgment, believing that the state had a moral and political duty to curate a perfect reality, where error was not a mistake but a crime against the revolution. This forced every writer, scientist, and teacher to operate in a state of constant, paralyzing self-censorship, always checking the latest party line before expressing an opinion. The result was a culture of intellectual sterility and profound boredom, where the official media was so predictable and dull that people stopped reading it entirely. The American citizen was overwhelmed by a sea of voices. The Soviet citizen was trapped in a desert of echoes, where the only thing being repeated was the state's own fading lie, a contrast that ensured that when the information wall finally fell, the Soviet population would not just read the new information. They would devour it with a ferocity that would consume the state itself. The ultimate failure of the Soviet information monopoly was its inability to adapt to the global telecommunications revolution of the late 20th century, while the American system thrived on the expansion of satellite television. The birth of early computer networks and the rapid decentralization of media, the Soviet state remained frozen in a 1930s mentality of one voice, one nation. The state's attempt to control every telephone line, every typewriter, and every radio frequency became a massive, unsustainable economic and technical burden. As the 1980s arrived, the digital age began to dissolve the Iron Curtain from within. The arrival of the video cassette recorder VCR allowed Western films and news to bypass the state's TV monopoly, and the first primitive personal computers posed a terrifying question to the censors. How can you register a font when a machine can create 1,000 of them? The American system was built to scale with technology, viewing more information as a market opportunity. The Soviet system was built to suppress technology, viewing more information as an existential threat. This technological gap meant that the Soviet citizen was no longer just misinformed. They were technologically blind, left behind in a world that was becoming increasingly interconnected and transparent, a reality that the leadership in Moscow could no longer hide, even from themselves. The introduction of glasnost, openness, by Mikhail Gorbachev was the final, fatal admission that the truth dictatorship had failed. The policy was intended to be a controlled release of information to help reform the stagnant economy, but it quickly became an unstoppable information avalanche. as decades of suppressed history, hidden crimes, and the true, agonizing statistics of Soviet failure were suddenly published in the very newspapers that had lied for 70 years. The psychological shock to the Soviet population was total. They learned about the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the true scale of the Stalinist purges, and the real depth of the economic abyss. The American citizen, used to the constant cycle of scandals and revelations, possessed a cynical immunity that kept their society stable. The Soviet citizen, having been fed a diet of absolute certainty, was intellectually shattered by the truth. The collapse of the information monopoly didn't just change the news. It destroyed the legitimacy of the Communist Party itself, proving that a state built on a monopoly of truth cannot survive a single day of genuine transparency. The silence of decades was replaced by a roar of public anger that the KGB could no longer suppress. The contrast in the preservation of national memory remains one of the most enduring legacies of the two systems. In the US, the archives are generally open, the libraries are vast and unrestricted, and the dark chapters of American history, from slavery to the treatment of indigenous peoples, are part of a continuous, public, and often painful national dialogue. This openness allows the society to evolve, to apologize, and to build a more resilient identity based on reality. The Soviet state left behind a maimed national memory, a history full of blank spots, erased names, and airbrushed photographs that left the post-Soviet generations with a profound sense of historical vertigo. The systematic destruction of documents and the murder of witnesses meant that for many families, the truth about their own ancestors was a state secret. The American system produced a nation of critics. The Soviet system produced a nation of historical orphans, searching for their own past in the ruins of the state's archives, a difference that explains why, even today, the struggle for truth and memory remains the most volatile political issue in the former Soviet space. The philosophical victory of the marketplace of ideas over the Ministry of Truth was the defining intellectual event of the century. The American model proved that while a free information environment is chaotic, biased, and often frustrating, it is the only system capable of self-correction and innovation. By allowing the individual to navigate the truth, the society developed a collective intelligence that was far superior to the rigid, top-down planning of the Kremlin. The Soviet attempt to create a perfect reality through censorship resulted in a perfect stagnation, where the lack of critical feedback allowed massive errors to accumulate until they became terminal. The state discovered that you can ban the word deficit, but you cannot feed the people with the silence that follows. The American citizens' freedom to be wrong was the very thing that allowed their society to eventually be right. The Soviet citizens' duty to be correct was the very thing that ensured their system was fundamentally, irrevocably wrong. This final exploration of the information war reveals the deepest secret of the Cold War. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it was defeated in battle, but because it lost the ability to tell its own people a believable story. The bread was scarce, the medicine was failing, and the law was a weapon. But it was the total collapse of the information wall that finally brought the system down. The American farmer, the American doctor, and the American lawyer were protected by a system that allowed them to see reality. The Soviet citizen was trapped in a hall of mirrors, where the only thing they could see was the state's fading, distorted reflection. The greatest strength of the West was not its wealth or its weapons, but the simple, revolutionary fact that it trusted its citizens with the truth, a trust that the Soviet Union, in its 70 years of existence, never dared to show, proving that the ultimate weapon of the Cold War was not the nuclear missile, but the unfiltered, unedited, and uncensored word. What do you think? Was the bigger danger to the Soviet citizen the lack of technology in the public hospital, or the existence of a secret Kremlin clinic for the elite? Share your thoughts below.